Our month of ghostly horrors begins to slowly draw to a close, much like a vampire's coffin lid at the break of dawn. We've recounted such fascinating and intriguing tales, from the bizarre mystery of the Rang Madan to the titillating tale of the Mary Celeste, and finally the well-known legend of the seas, the Flying Dutchman. But to bring our month to a terrifying crescendo of a conclusion, I present you a story rife with horror. One of brave military men used for ghoulish scientific experiments, and an intriguing government cover-up that has led to nearly 80 years of research and prying into secrets held as tight as the Kraken's grip. This is a story of the dreaded Philadelphia experiment, a tale that bends the rules of physics and tears at the very fabric of reality, at the expense of lives of one of the most unfortunate destroyer's crew. Let us begin for the final time, shall we?
July of 1943. For 2 years, the United States has been embroiled in one of the most devastating conflicts the world has ever seen. Desperate to aid their allies embattled in Fortress Europe and North Africa, convoys braved the waters of the Atlantic constantly, trying in any way to keep a constant supply train from the United States to Europe. But the brave sailors of the U.S. Navy, U.S. Coast Guard, and Merchant Marines take their lives into their hands each time they leave the pier and steam out into the Atlantic. Because seemingly every convoy becomes the prey to the wolf pack, the German U-boats. In 1942 alone, German U-boats sank a total of 6 million tons of Allied shipping, amounting to nearly 2 ships sunk every day. Over 30,000 Allied sailors lost their lives from U-boats alone. They were sinking Allied ships nearly faster than they could build them. Something had to be done. Something desperate. So in early summer of 1943, a small Cannon-class escort destroyer sat in dry dock at the Philadelphia Naval Yards. This ship, the USS Eldridge, was being loaded with advanced generators and technology. The ship, not even a month into the fleet, was about to make the biggest leap in technology since the Wright brothers took to the sky. They were being outfitted with an experimental device that would render the vessel invisible to detection. Utilizing the brilliant physicist Albert Einstein's unified field theory, the ship would alter not only its gravitational field, but also its electromagnetic field. By using powerful generators to bend the rays of light around the ship, the vessel would be rendered entirely invisible. The USS Eldridge DE-173 was ordered by the US Navy in 1942, one of 116 other Cannon-class destroyer escorts ordered around this time. Her keel was laid in Newark, New Jersey's Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company's yard on the 22nd of February 1943. The ship was 306 feet, or 93 meters in length, 36 feet 10 inches or 11.23 meters at the beam, and had an 11-foot 8-inch or 3.56 meter navigable draft. She was powered by 4 General Motors Mod 16 TAC 278A main diesel engines that could produce 6,000 ship horsepower. The engines were connected to 4 diesel-electric transmissions that drove the ship's 2 screws. This allowed USS Eldridge to move along at about 21 knots. Not blazingly fast, but the ship wasn't a destroyer, it was a destroyer escort. For those unaware or unfamiliar, a destroyer is utilized for escorting and screening for large military fleets. They're designed to outpace and move faster than the cruisers, battleships, and carriers of Navy fleets, thus are pretty speedy. Destroyer escorts, on the other hand, are designed for escorting merchant ships or troop transports. They tended to be a bit smaller and less heavily armed, but they were most notably slower. The Eldridge had a complement of 216 sailors, 201 enlisted, and 15 officers. She was armed as well as any other destroyer escort, 3 3-inch or 76mm Mark 22 main guns, a 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft gun, 8 20mm Oerlikon AA guns, 3 21-inch torpedo tubes, a Hedgehog Mark 10 anti-submarine mortar launcher, then finally 8 Mark 6 depth charge projectors, and 2 Mark 9 depth charge racks. Freshly painted, loaded with new tech, and ready for war, USS Eldridge DE-173 sat in a dry dock in the Philadelphia Navy Yards. Around 100 military officers, researchers, and technicians observed her as her entire crew sat on board, ready for this test that could very well change the tide of the war and the way the Navy fought altogether. The generators on board were energized, and before the very eyes of all in attendance, the ship didn't just become hard to detect for radar or sonar. It became shrouded in a greenish fog, then entirely invisible. Einstein's unified field theory was correct. Light was bent around the ship, rendering it invisible to the naked eye. The researchers were elated. This experiment couldn't have gone any better. So they thought. The machine was powered down, and what they found on board was disturbing. Several sailors had received terrible burns on their bodies. All of them felt nauseous. Some seemed to be terrified and emotionally unhinged from the experience. One man had ended up one deck below the one he had been standing on, seemingly phasing through the deck plates beneath his feet. But more disturbing, his hand had somehow become fused with the bulkhead next to him, fused to the steel. In the words of the researchers, some of the men went completely bananas. But despite the terrible effects on the crew, the experiment had been an incredible success. A 300-foot long, 1,600-ton hunk of steel had just been made entirely invisible. This was an incredible breakthrough. So another test was ordered, this time on the 28th of October 1943. One more test on the USS Eldridge. One more chance to iron out the kinks before sending this tech out to win the war for the Allies, utilizing a fleet of invisible warships. So on the 28th of October, in broad daylight, the Eldridge was used as a guinea pig once more. No changes, no recalibrations. They activated the field once more. Once more the ship vanished. But not from sight at all. But from Philadelphia entirely. The ship seemed to almost phase out of reality. The ship immediately and astoundingly reappeared almost 300 miles away in Norfolk, Virginia. There at anchor was the merchant vessel SS Andrew Furuseth. The crew stared in astonished wonder as with a blue flash of light appeared an entire destroyer escort, fully loaded, ready for war, and glowing a dull green. The ships bobbed inside of each other for a few minutes until the Eldridge, just as fast as she appeared, disappeared. She popped back into existence, back in Philadelphia. The amazed and horrified researchers surged aboard to congratulate the crew and ask what had occurred. But what they found was more horrific than before. Men screamed in agony, their bodies mangled and burned, all half insane and screaming bloody murder. More than a few had become fused with the metal of the ship, entire limbs now forever part of the Eldridge. Some had half their bodies engulfed in steel and were breathing their last breath. In one spot was simply a pile of bone and organs. What had once been a man was now turned inside out, left to die in a horrific fashion. Some were never seen again, vanished, trapped somewhere between the folds of our reality and the next. The experiment was deemed a massive failure. An intense cover-up and cleanup operation was performed. Men were brainwashed and reassigned by the government. Scientists were paid off, logs were modified. Everything the government could do to hide their insidious testing that day. Testing that led to the deaths, dismemberments, and devastation of numerous Navy sailors.
Well, damn, there you have it, I guess. A tale straight out of a science fiction novel. A disturbing scientific experiment that sounds way too crazy to be true. But it is true, you see. It's all just a government conspiracy, and they just want they want you to think it's all fake. Those big dumb clearly we all all right, just have at it. I don't believe in this one.
All right, so in researching this one, I've kind of discovered that even the usual crackpots tend to all agree that this entire thing is a load of crap. See, unlike the Mary Celeste and the Ourang Medan, which had some plausibility and truths mixed in with the craziness, this one just goes all in and refuses to even give a scrap of evidence. Yet somehow, almost 80 years later, this one still pops up and is defended tooth and nail by absolute lunatics, in spite of the fact that it's entirely supported by just one man, whose credibility would make Richard Nixon look like a patron saint. In truth, no one had even heard of the Philadelphia experiment and likely the USS Eldridge until 1956, over a decade later. In 1955, a man named Morris K. Jessup wrote a book named The Case for the UFO Unidentified Flying Object, in which he discussed the possibility of aliens and other paranormal and extraterrestrial things of the sort. After writing this mildly successful book, he received letters from a man named Carlos Miguel Allende, a man who came forward with fascinating claims, ridiculing Jessup's knowledge about physics and other things and proclaiming his own knowledge of certain events. He described having witnessed a naval experiment in 1943 using Einstein's unified field theory. He also later claimed to have been personally tutored by Albert Einstein, so not sure where that came from. Intrigued, naturally, by all this, Jessup wrote back, prying for more information, to which Allende was happy to comply, giving him the full, fascinating story. But where he did get quiet was when asked for evidence, to which he assured Jessup it did exist, but when pressed for it, he would never be able to provide even a scrap. Over a series of 50 letters, the two corresponded until Jessup was about fed up with it. Understandably so. Then finally in 1957, the Office of Naval Research, or ONR, contacted Jessup stating that they had received a copy of his book in the mail. But the margins had all been filled with notes and annotations. It appeared that 3 different individuals had written in the margins various comments pertaining to strange pseudoscience and odd otherworldly research. One of these writers seemingly extraterrestrial in origin. In actuality, it was described as crackpot rambling about nonsensical science fiction nonsense. More damning, Jessup recognized the handwriting of all 3 sets of writers. They were all Carlos Allende. He had just used 3 different shades of ink to try and make it look like more than one author.
So this dude sends a copy of his fanfic to the government? What a badass. Or as we in the spooky horror host world like to say, a bat ass. Ooh.
Naturally, the ONR was curious on Jessup's take on all of this, to which he explained the correspondence between himself and Mr. Allende. The ONR investigated a bit before writing it all off as nothing more than a crackpot story. Sadly, that hasn't stopped ridiculous speculation based upon nothing, even spawning a movie in 1984 by the same name, which was mildly successful. So let's get to the truth behind this story. Like the Mary Celeste, the USS Eldridge was a real ship, commissioned in 1943, sold to the Greek Navy in 1951, and sold for scrap and torn apart in 1999. So too was the SS Andrew Forsyth. In fact, this Carlos Miguel Allende was in the Merchant Marines and was stationed aboard the USS Andrew Forsyth during the time of this alleged experiment. But that's about all the truth that you'll get from this story. The official logs from the USS Eldridge have her going to a number of places during this time period. She was put in the water in July in New Jersey, but wasn't completed and commissioned until August. Then she stayed in port in New York until September. After this, she steamed down to the Bahamas to perform her shakedown cruise and readiness testing throughout the month of October, the month that the experiment apparently took place. She didn't return to New York or Norfolk until November. The ship had never even been to Philadelphia, which is all in the logs, the ship's war diary, and something all the members of the crew stated when subsequently harassed from the 1950s onwards after this story was made up. As for the Andrew Forsyth, not only does the captain of the ship deny he or any of the crew saw anything whilst in Norfolk, Virginia at the time, they not only weren't in Virginia at the time, they weren't even in the same area as the Eldridge. At the time, they were steaming towards the Mediterranean. Now, there are a lot of theories to explain what happened. Some say the government was testing degaussing equipment on the ship. This was a relatively new method developed around 1943. It would use electrical cables surrounding the ship to reduce the ship's magnetic signature, making it invisible to magnetic mines and torpedoes. Some say perhaps Allende heard this and was confused. Others state that the USS Eldridge utilized a special protected shipping channel from Philadelphia to Norfolk, which of course was kept a secret at the time, so the ship traveled a long distance at a seemingly impossible amount of time. But honestly, the theories are moot points, because you actually need evidence of a real thing occurring to provide evidence to the contrary. The only evidence for the event comes from a single man's testimony, Carlos Miguel Allende, or his real name, Carl Allen. Carl Allen was born in 1925 and was the eldest of 5 brothers. He was described by his family as rather intelligent in school, but never held down a job long, and was a drifter. He was also apparently very well known for pulling pranks and lying to get out of work. In 1942, he joined the Marine Corps, but apparently served for less than a year before being discharged. Immediately after, he joined the Merchant Marines in 1943, serving until 1952 before finding some other jobs. He spent his life moving around and sending crazy letters to anyone that will listen. On 2 separate occasions, he even came out saying that the whole thing was made up as a hoax, only rescinding that before dying in 1994, claiming it was real, and leaving us with the plague of this insane story. Now this part's a little more rambly, because I didn't want to write all of this down, but let's just talk about this story and just how ridiculous it is. First of all, if you're gonna try making something invisible, why start with a destroyer escort, a 300-foot-long, 1,600-ton ship? Why start with that? I mean, supposedly, they probably did smaller scale tests before this, but do something small. Patrol boats. Hell, a cup. Right? You're gonna start with a destroyer escort. Second of all, with the entire crew on board? Okay, let's look at Soviet Russia with the space race. Okay, the Soviets until the 1950s handled most of their problems with throwing as many people as they can at them. But even in the space race, they're like, let's send something into space. Yes, but let's not put a person because that's dangerous. Let's send a doggy. Even the Russians were like, that's a little too dangerous. But the US military went, 216 guys, we can lose that. Let's just throw them onto the ship that we're going to teleport to some other dimension or something. I don't know. If they had gotten so close to invisibility and teleportation, why don't we have it now? Everyone's like, oh, well, it was too dangerous and all that. That's BS. If we had actually teleported a ship in the 40s, you're telling me we wouldn't have teleportation now? No. If we had rendered an entire ship invisible in the 40s and a few people got hurt, you're telling me we wouldn't be doing that now? You know how many people got hurt researching radiation and nuclear technology, and we still have that today? Come on. Really? So they just went, people got hurt. Let's not do that anymore. Yeah, I don't think so. Third, explain to me how someone becomes fused with a bulkhead. So, I'm not the most scientific person. I drive boats, I do research on history, I know navigation. That's about it. I don't understand physics. But how can something become fused with something else? Did their hand fall into the bulkhead and then the metal just get left in the in-between dimension that they went to or something? Or are you telling me that the steel fused with atomic level, subatomic level with the flesh of a person's hand? So 2 solid objects occupy the same space at the same time. I don't see how that works. That doesn't make sense to me. Second of all, I'd love to imagine the cleanup of this, because you got people half stuck in bulkheads. You have sailors, half of their body stuck in a bulkhead. You can't just leave that there. You can't just cut it off. It'll leave a weird stain or something. You gotta cut them out of the bulkhead. I'm imagining when the Roadrunner tricks the coyote into running into a solid wall, and he just leaves a coyote-shaped outline. There's just sailor-shaped outlines that they left in the bulkhead, and they just welded metal over it. I'd love to see the conversation, the next seaman to report onto the Eldridge out of basic, and he's like, oh, what's with the weird shape in the wall? And they're like, yeah, somebody got fused to the wall there. It was a weird experiment, some weird government cover-up. Don't talk about it, though. I don't know, that doesn't make any sense. Also, there's a weird element that some of the stories include that say the Eldridge traveled time. Some say that it traveled 10 minutes into the past, which, I mean, if it got sent 10 minutes into the past, but ended up in Norfolk, sure. But if it got sent 10 minutes into the past in Philadelphia, wouldn't that mean for 10 minutes there were 2 USS Eldridges? And how does that work? Was one, like, placed next to it? Was it on top of it? Were they both inside of each other? Like, how can you send something 10 minutes into the past? That means you're getting ready for the experiment 10 minutes before the Eldridge pops into being, and you're like, whoa, what the hell? And then it disappears, and you're like, oh, that's weird. Let's start the experiment. Like, that doesn't make sense in my brain. I don't understand it. Anyways, sorry for the rambling. Back to this. In the end, this hoax has no leg to stand on, and people only seem to be able to sputter about government cover-ups and hypnosis. The only people that ever support this nonsense are the folks that are just too insane to even be argued with. Despite apparently hundreds of witnesses all saying they saw nothing, we apparently had just one man the government forgot to brainwash? A drifting well-known liar that even himself said he made it up twice? This story is stupid, and I feel dumber for having researched it. Please, Creepster, take this away so I can go back to reading about historical events in peace.
Hey bro, I feel like your heart wasn't really into researching this one. Are you sure there isn't anything you missed? Maybe some black helicopters or mysterious men in all black. Maybe some kind...
Please, for the love of King Neptune and everything holy, just let me talk about my boring sinking ships again.
Alright, fine. The end of the month draws near anyway. I feel the portal between our worlds closing, my connection weakening. Soon I will be forced to return to my hellish realm from whence I came, perhaps until next year.
Oh my god, you're going back to hell?
No, close. Cleveland, Ohio!
Oh, geez, that may actually be worse.
Yes, true, but at least it's not Detroit, right? It's not Detroit!
Anyways, fair winds and following seas, shipmates.